Do you guys know how long you guys have been podcasting?
What time is it?
I think it's been 2 years, hasn't it, Ted? I think it's 2 years.
It might be 3 now because we do
It might be 3 years, Ted. Is it 3 years,
Yeah,
Ted?
it might be, yeah, because I think we do 2 seasons in a year and we're on season 6. So
Okay, there you go.
You know, I'm no Enrico Fermi, but according to my calculations.
There you go. 3 years, Matt.
The answer is 2.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask you guys, like, how are you guys enjoying it? Because I remember when you started to say, let's just try this. And I think we're well past the point of experimentation and just trying this because you got something.
Well, I don't want to speak for Ted, but I absolutely love it. I think it's a hoot. I love the process of coming up with ideas for the podcast. I love the idea, the process of coming up with ideas for guests. And the other thing that I love is it enables Ted and I to do what we've always done, which is head into the studio and wander up the highway and see where it takes us. We always did that on the radio, and I know it was a source of great consternation and aggravation for many, many bosses of ours over the years. But I thought what we did and what we do lends itself to, I hate to keep using the word authenticity because, it always was like, one of the highest compliments that we ever got when we were doing the radio show is people say, I feel like I'm sitting at the table with you guys. And we drag that into the podcast studio. And of course, there's no chains. There's no, I don't want to be dramatic, but there's no, what's the word I'm looking for, Ted? There's no fences. You just do what you want, say what you want, and damn the torpedoes. And
Program directors.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Well, you don't carry the responsibility of, oh my God, if I say that and oops, did I say shit? Oh God. Although I was listening with my wife, Jess, the other day we were driving to the airport very early, and it was one of my very first listens to morning radio in over 2 or 3 years. A, because I don't get up, and B, because I don't find there's anything on the radio. And we were listening to Willie, Don Percy's son. And I said to Jess, did he just say bullshit? And he did on morning radio in Canada's second largest English market. He said, oh, that's bullshit, and just kept going. And I don't know, Ted, you're still on the air. Is this permissible?
Well, normally I would say no. I actually said shit on Remembrance Day or the day before Remembrance Day, because Remembrance Day was on a Saturday this year, and I was reading a segment of the letter that my grandmother received, a letter of condolence from the regimental chaplain after her brother was killed in Italy. And I described it as being written in the mud and the cold and the rain and the blood and the shit of a December Italian battlefield. And it just kind of came out. And I thought to myself, I probably shouldn't have said that, but in that context,
yeah,
because it was like it was an emotionally charged moment. So I think anyone who would have heard it would have forgiven me, just as the same as the time we called my ex-wife Danielle when we were still married. We called her on the air to let her know the boys weren't going to school that morning because there was a water leak at the school, and my son Charlie answered, and Danielle picked up the extension back in the days when we had actual fixed phones and extensions. And she didn't realize that we had called her on the air, and she picked up the extension, and when she heard me tell Charlie, you don't have school today, buddy, she went, oh, you're fucking kidding me. On the air. And nobody complained, quite the opposite. We got a lot of feedback from people saying that was real.
Yeah.
Like, we can relate, She's home with a newborn baby. It's the end of March break. She can't wait to get those boys back to school so that she only has to look after the newborn. And then she finds out that they're still going to be at home. You're fucking kidding me.
Well, I think I think context has a lot to do with it, and I've taken us off topic. Sorry, Matt, but it's not a consideration in the podcast studio. We don't give it a second thought.
I think there's some normalization, though. I think podcasting has normalized bad words on the radio. Again, authenticity. Yeah. We listen to it in our headphones when we listen to podcasts. We're kind of used to it. So it's not so much of a shock when you hear it on the radio. And then who's left to pick up a pen or go to the internet to complain to the CBSC for this stuff? I can't remember the last time the CBSC actually had complaints of that sort of nature. It's much different now.
Probably Brother Jake and Jerry Forbes generated quite a few of those, I think, over the years.
Yeah, and they wore it like a badge of pride as well. They should have, but that was in a day, that was in an era when there were interesting and wild people on the radio. No offense to anybody who's still on the radio, but in this era, there isn't a talent pool that has a big marquee name in every market in Canada. There are a couple still left, I think, but can you name 5 big, very famous, popular morning men in Canada off the top of your head? I can't. There's
I don't
Ted
know if
Bird.
I can name. I was going to say, I don't know if I can name one. Listen, if I'm near the top of that list, that tells you a lot. On the tiny little radio station that I work at with the transmitter that's run by a hamster running on a wheel.
But you know what I mean, right, Ted? I mean, we used to say,
100%,
Jerry and Jake and Derringer and Wally Crowder and George Balkin and all of the Don Percy, and there was somebody in every market that was making a big impact that people listened to every morning. And I can't come up with. I think you would say Willie Percy here in Vancouver, along with Jeff O'Neill at CFox, and I guess that's because I'm in Vancouver. Who would you say in Montreal? Who would you say in Toronto?
There's nobody in Montreal.
John Moore has been at CFRB for a number of years. I wouldn't say John's an outrageous morning man and broadcaster. I don't know who's doing morning radio at any of the other ones, but maybe that's because I'm out of the game. I don't know. Matt, you would know better.
I'm not sure that I do. I mean, the people that I would name, they've been there and have done the job, but outrageous doesn't fit the bill.
Yeah, and outrageous, and you don't want to miss it. You have to tune in every morning. Sorry, I just put ice in my mouth. Tune in every morning to see what you were going to miss. You know what I mean? It was an era of, hey, did you hear what Dawn did this morning? Hey, did you hear what, so-and-so did this morning? I know we sound like guys from another era because we are, but that's, my point is those days of compelling, interesting Canadian broadcast standards radio, those are gone.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's part of the decline of legacy media in general. Radio and television and newspapers, legacy media, have all taken a hit because everybody's online now, right? So the advertising revenue isn't what it once was, so they're not spending money on big talent. So the big talent is doing other things.
And everybody is now self-appointed. I love, like on TikTok, you see people doing the news, There's people are just like, well, I'm going to be a news person, so I'm going to do a TikTok video about what's happening in the city today.
Well, they do that on some radio stations now too. One in Montreal where we used to work, where they don't have a news person, they have the show hosts, talk about what's going on at the top of the hour, and there's zero credibility in that. None.
Right.
I was at the Jets game on the weekend, and some guys were talking about, the power play, the third line. And at the intermission, I turned around and I asked them, I said, where do you guys get your sports information? Like when you want to talk about the things you're talking about? Because there's no more sports radio here in Winnipeg. They got rid of them across the country, except for Montreal. Most of it is now moved online. But I asked them, I said, where do you get it? And they said, we get it from Andrew Patterson, who happens to have a YouTube and podcast show where he talks about the Winnipeg Jets every day. But how? And I said, but he did mention one thing. He says, I wish that it was still on the radio and I could listen to it in the car. I have to use my Apple CarPlay, but he did mention the show by name, and that's where he goes. Radio gave it up. Most of everything that we're talking about here is because radio let it go and give it up. They gave it up.
Yeah, I agree. They they created the vacuum that people are, things like, guys on YouTube are filling. That's what happened. And it's been interesting for us to watch the growth of the podcast. Very slow. When we first did the podcast, we thought, well, let's see what happens and see if anybody watches or listens or cares. And slowly but surely, it much like my radio career. Ted and I were talking about this last weekend. I was in Montreal for a fundraiser that Ted and I hosted. And I was saying, both Ted and I are starting to notice, Ted has a lot of feedback from Lite 106.7, which is the radio station that he does the morning show for in Hudson, just outside of Montreal. But also there's a number of people that approach us and say, hey, I loved you guys on the radio and really enjoy the podcast. And we're just noticing, small, it's like when we first started to do the morning show years and years and years ago, you'd see little incremental growth and small signs. Somebody would say something, or you would get a letter, or somebody would stop you on the street. There are sort of small indicators that people are starting to catch on, and that's happened with us. With thankfully not just supporters but also advertisers. And I don't want to go into it, but somebody has talked to us about doing perhaps a live version of the podcast at a local theater. So those are indications to me that there's a growth period there. And in what Ted and I are doing is we're doing a Montreal focused podcast, because I think there's a giant space there that radio has left open. People are looking for entertainment or content about the city that they live in that used to be the driving force behind radio that radio has abandoned. And it seems to be, we're not going to sell our podcast to Amazon for $80 million, but it seems
we're not.
To be,
are you sure?
Yeah, the guys at Smartless already got that money, Ted. Okay. But it's locally supported by local advertisers and local listeners, and that's what radio used to do.
Well, you're doing all the things that I would have advised against when you started the show.
Yes, and
that was to do it geolocal, but you went and reestablished it. And to your point, Terry, there's a big giant hole in the market. And also, Ted's in the market.
Yes.
And Ted, you're doing a show live every day, and then you do this podcast with Terry. You're doing both. I mean, how do you see the difference between the two in the Montreal market? Because you have to speak to one set of audience live and then the other on demand.
Right. I'm a little more specific with my radio audience because, as Terry mentioned, it's in Hudson, just outside of Montreal, what's called the Vaudreuil-Soulanges area. So I'm focused more on what's going on there and on the West Island because that's where our listeners are. And I'm probably more attentive to my content on the localization of my content on the radio show than I am on the podcast. On the podcast, I'm okay with going off in any direction because the podcast reaches beyond Vaudreuil-Soulanges and the West Island. So, yeah, I guess I have a different mindset for each one, but it's not something that I don't consciously, when I go into the podcast studio, I don't consciously switch gears from the radio show, especially when I'm with Terry, because we just do what we've always done. It's very second nature to sit down in the studio with Terry and just go. Sorry, that's an inside joke. Tell that story, Terry.
Was that the morning of me banging on the on?
No, that's someone else. That was Richard Deschamps, who was doing
right.
news on CJAD.
Yes,
and
you tell
and
it,
there were multiple technical screw ups. Like he tried to introduce a reporter and something happened, and then he tried to introduce another voice clip and it went wrong, and there was a great big pause, like it was probably about 5 seconds, and it seemed like a minute and a half, and then you hear Richard go, "Just go," which was his way of saying to the producer, "Play the commercial."
I give up. What? How did that come up? What were we talking about? I was about to say something.
Well, we were talking about Matt had asked me about the difference between doing the morning radio show and then doing the podcast.
Yeah. There's something that's I don't know. Maybe it's just the way I'm made, but there's just something really special about sliding behind a microphone, whether it's on radio or to do a podcast. It's communicating and telling stories has been what I've done my whole life for a job, and it never felt like a job to me. So the podcast, especially for a guy who I couldn't get hired, anywhere in the business today, not because I've done something criminal, or not because I'm no good at what I do, but the business has altered its direction so that there is not room for people who are experienced and had a good run. Those people have all been pushed aside. So it's even more special to me that, I can pop into the studio with Ted, even if it's just twice a year, and have a little bit of fun, because retirement ain't all it's cracked up to be.
It's also gratifying that the podcast is getting traction, because it's such a different landscape and a so much more cluttered landscape than the radio. I mean, everybody's got a podcast now, and everybody who wants to have a podcast can have a podcast. So for us to actually see the kind of growth that we've had and get and retain the sponsors that we have is really gratifying. And the sponsorship thing goes back to our radio days. Those are relationships we established when we were on the radio, in radio's heydays, and those are people who still believe in us. And maybe that should say something to the people who run radio stations.
You would think it would.
If a couple of guys like us who've been around since Christ wore short pants can still retain sponsors who were part of our show, 30 years ago. If making money is the name of the game, why would that not resonate with them?
Well, one of the things that I love about the sponsors is they've always trusted us. They've always trusted us to deliver their message, and they've always trusted us to reach an audience. And a couple of them have said, whether you guys are reaching, because a couple of them jumped in at the beginning not knowing what was going to happen. And a couple of them said to us, listen, whether you guys reach an audience or not, you guys make great brand ambassadors for us. Like one of the car dealerships that is one of our sponsors, Jaguar Land Rover Laval, they like the idea that we're a good brand representative for them, and that's a really high compliment. And the other thing that about it, again, to go back to what Ted was saying about it catching on and what you were saying, Matt, about you would have advised us to go entirely in the other direction. That's what I said to Ted. Ted was mentioning there are just so many people out there with a podcast. And when we first sat down, I said to him, listen, we can't compete with Joe Rogan, Mark Maron, the guys in SmartList. We don't have those Rolodexes. We don't have those connections. Why don't we go looking for an audience that's looking for us? And it seems to have worked.
A lot of people talk about the future of podcasting, and it's been kicked around like geolocal. How can you have a geolocal podcast when you're putting it out there for the whole world? And, I'd look at a slogan for maybe what your show could be. It's for Montrealers, but it's also for ex-Montrealers
Yes.
who want to stay in contact. I haven't heard from Mitch Garber in years. I haven't heard from Bruce Hills in years. These are not names you hear when you're in Winnipeg or if you're in Vancouver. The names just don't come up as much. And then you're reconnecting me with my city and my past.
And as an ex-English Montrealer, that's another market. It's one of the reasons the Gazette does so well is because they have subscribers all over the country who've left Montreal. And pardon me, as an ex-Montrealer, you can live away from the city for a very, very long time, and it never leaves you. It's just, Mitch Garber said it on the podcast. I said to Mitch, pardon me, I'm sorry. I said to Mitch, with your resources, you could choose to live anywhere on the planet. Why do you choose to live in Montreal? And he talked about the streets that he grew up on and the families that he became friends with and the restaurants that he loves and, everything about the city that speaks to him. I think there's something special about that. There's something about Montreal. Winnipeg has a little bit of this too, because I lived in Winnipeg, but there's something about Montreal that's unique. Maybe it's because everybody leaves. So many English people have left and they bring their memories with them. And, somebody was telling me that, hundreds of thousands of people subscribe to the Gazette from Alberta and British Columbia and Manitoba and California and Nevada. And, these are all people who want to stay in touch. And the podcast, I guess, does do that. And as you point out, Matt, Mitch Garber triggered a number of notes from a number of people that I hadn't heard from in a long while, because they had interaction with him when he was just getting started. And there's something gratifying about that too, that the podcast sort of, can weave all of that together. It's kind of cool. It's cool that we would be thought of as a gathering place for expats.
I would also like to think that whether or not you're from Montreal, for the most part, our podcasts and our guests are interesting and can resonate beyond Montreal. Listening to Bruce Hills talk about the Just for Laughs Festival that he is the president of, the largest comedy festival in the world, you don't have to be from Montreal, I don't think, to find his stories and his insights interesting. Ditto Mitch Garber, who's one of Canada's most successful businessmen and one of the biggest individual success stories this country's seen in the last 10 or 15 years. Put whatever time frame you want on it. I mean, the guy's a huge success story and a really interesting and compelling guy to listen to. So, it's not like we're talking to Kenny, the paper guy on Crescent Street sort of thing. Remember Kenny?
I do.
You stick him into the bars at 2:00 in the morning. Montreal Gazette. Anybody want a Gazette? Like we're not that local.
But is it sad that I know who Kenny is?
Yeah,
it is,
no,
yeah,
not at all.
yeah.
There's a Montreal legend right there. When in the days prior to the internet, when we knew there was going to be a radio article in the Saturday Gazette, we would force ourselves to stay at Grumpy's until 2:30 in the morning
because we knew Kenny was coming with the paper.
Yeah, because Kenny would come with the morning paper. Like if you were downtown, you got the Gazette like literally hot off the presses, and we would sit at Grumpy's and get the paper and go, oh, it's just an article of paper is.
So, Matt, I'm curious, what would you have said to us? What would you have told us to do in the beginning versus what direction we decided to take?
I probably would have suggested against the geolocal. But what, I think with the two of you together, you have to do a local show. But I was thinking more of if Terry were to do a show just on his own, it would be sort of, mass North American, let's get Oprah on the show kind of thing. But right. You've already said why that's a bad idea. So now I agree.
So I ruined everything then.
No, but you know what?
He didn't answer.
Ted ruins everything. No, I think, the thing about that is this goes, this goes back to all kinds of different different eras and different stories, even in broadcasting. Like when Howard Stern came to Montreal, I remember friends of mine saying, "Oh, wow, what are you going to do when they let you go? You know, where are you going to work? What's going to happen to you?" And I say that because the idea that I could do a podcast and call, I don't know, get Matt Damon on the podcast. It's not going to happen. Like, nobody knows who I am outside of the Montreal area. Nobody's going to gamble. You know what it is. PR flacks today are like, oh Christ, we're not, I don't know who you are. I listen to all kinds of podcasts, and, I was listening to a podcast the other day from England, and Gordon Ramsay was on. And I find Gordon Ramsay fascinating. And I thought, man, it would be so much fun to have Gordon Ramsay on a podcast. He's not going to do a fucking podcast with us. His people are going to say, I don't know, it's a note from two clowns in Montreal. Next. That's the problem. Even in Canada, I think of like the reach that you could have nationally, say on Sirius, but do you know I don't even know of any Sirius Canada programming that makes that kind of reach. Like it's too hard to, build that kind of thing. I've been watching the documentary on Smartless, the Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes, and Will Arnett podcast. That's massive success, and during they took the thing on the road, sold it out every night live in all kinds of American markets. And their guest list included Matt Damon, Jennifer Aniston, Jimmy Kimmel, and those guys pick up the phone, like Jason Bateman picks up the phone and calls Kimmel and says, "Hey, we're going to be in LA. Come on, let's, you want to do the podcast." Who can compete with that? You can't compete with that.
And most of the data, by the way, I've seen is that when a podcaster lands a big guest, it doesn't move the needle.
Really, eh?
Yeah, and
That's
then
interesting.
And then the next week they'll say, "Well, it's just us, a Q&A," and they get even more downloads than they did for having the star-studded guest. Most people, when they come to your podcast, they want to listen to the hosts of the show.
Really?
But there's a huge misconception that a guest is going to land you a bunch of downloads. So Gordon Ramsay's a good example. So if Gordon Ramsay did come on your show, I don't know how thrilled I would be to go listen to that, because I can get Gordon Ramsay anywhere
else. Good point. I never thought of that. I was looking at that, Matt, through selfish eyes, because I would love to sit and interview Gordon Ramsay.
Yeah.
I
Listen,
never thought of that.
you do well with it, but then you're going to be sitting there going, "Why did Ziggy Eichenbaum get more downloads than Gordon Ramsay?"
Yeah.
Zig.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Terry and I. Go ahead, Terry.
Zig was a great guest, was what I was going to say.
Yep.
He's the unofficial mayor of the nightlife on Crescent Street, and has been for years. And that targets a Montreal audience. Go ahead, Ted. Sorry.
Terry and I try to make a point of doing at least 2 of our 10 shows that we do in a season with just the 2 of us, for the reason that you just mentioned, because it seems like folks who listen to us on the radio, they want to hear Terry and Ted. It's great to have guests as well, but they really enjoy it when it's just the 2 of us doing what we did for 35 years.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was going to be a question. Who are the 2 people who did not want to come on your podcast this season?
No,
I was joking.
Okay, sorry.
But I did listen to 2 episodes that I can remember this summer. One of them was the Ziggy episode, where he told, some incredible stories. But then you also just did an episode with the 2 of you, and you talked about the things that resonated with me. You spent 15 minutes going on about high grocery prices, of which before we started this episode, you were still going on about high grocery prices at Walmart. But it's the good stuff. It's why I listen to the show. It's a great idea.
Because my wife works, I'm retired, so now I'm the old man shopper, and I'm now the guy that pushes the cart around Walmart, going, Jesus Christ, look at the fuck. I'm paying that for that goddamn Christ. That was $2 last week. Jesus. Like mumbling under my breath. But the thing about it is I'm not alone. And that was one of the things that always seemed to resonate on the radio show. When something burned our ass, we brought it into the studio, and often a lot of people would relate.
You guys could do this remotely, but you don't. You get into the studio, and tell me a little bit about the studio and where you record it, and Pantelis and how it all came together.
Well, when Terry, quote unquote, retired or was retired, Pantelis approached us and said, Mike and I, Mike being Mike Ward, who's a huge podcaster and comedian in Quebec. I think he's got the most listened to French language podcast in the world, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Confirmed.
Yeah. Mike said to Pantelis, and then Pantelis said to us, there needs to be a Terry and Ted podcast. And so they offered us their studio and their infrastructure and their distribution network at no cost. I don't know how they benefit. I think it helps Pantelis. I guess that he has us on his roster. Locally, it looks good for him to have a couple of guys who are well known in the local market on his roster. And so we go into the studio. Terry flies in from Vancouver. Talk about doing it for the love of the gig. I drive across town. He flies across the country.
And somehow he beats you to the studio.
That's right, yeah. and we do what we describe as seasons of 10, and we do 2 a year, so we do 20 in a year. And the studio, we have a producer, Poseidon, not his real name. He is not, in fact, the Greek god of the sea. And I would say it's a state-of-the-art studio, Terry.
Absolutely, it is. It
yeah.
is. And
At video-wise as well, like they've got multiple cameras set up in the studio. Poseidon would have been a good Hockey Night in Canada director. He's really good at switching the cameras at the right time.
Yeah.
And catching the flow of the show. So it's technically and aesthetically, it's a real quality product. Whether it's interesting or not, I mean, that's up to us, and we try to make it as interesting as we can. But that's how it's come about, and they don't take a penny off of us. So again, I don't know how it benefits him above and beyond having a couple of guys who folks know in this city on the roster. I don't know if there's also some revenue from YouTube for the views that we get on YouTube, but YouTube is not where we get most of our action with the podcast. I don't think. I think our audio downloads are significantly greater than the number of YouTube views we get, which is too bad.
Absolutely, it is.
We're quite handsome. I'm surprised that more people aren't watching us on YouTube just to go look at those hunky men.
And the other issue about being in the studio, Matt, and you know this from your years in radio, is it's just not the same doing this. If you and I and Ted were sitting at your dining room table in Tuxedo, there's a different vibe and there's a different energy that happens. Not that this is shit or bad, but we know from the years of working together in studios, when you're sitting across from somebody and looking them in the eye and picking up the same vibe in the room, that changes the dynamic of the broadcast or the podcast. And prior to me having heart surgery last fall, Ted and I did a remote season. And interestingly enough, in terms of downloads and numbers, it wasn't as strong as when Ted and I are in the studio. And it's something that I think is super important. I don't know what the ingredient is, but there's an ingredient there that's missing when you're on Zoom. Ted and I know this from doing, I co-host a little Saturday show with him on Lite 106, and we do that remotely. And I think it's fine, and I think it's terrific, and we have an awful lot of fun. I come up into this room where I am now, and as you can hear, there's nothing wrong with the quality, and the sound is good, and it sounds like we're in the same room, but we're not. And Ted and I, when I was in Montreal last week, we made arrangements to record that show because it's a pre-recorded show. We made arrangements to record that show in the Lite 106 studio, and Ted and I said after we were done, Ted was driving me back to the hotel, and Ted said it's just different when we're in the same room. So I think it's
better.
important.
It was better.
Better.
As you say,
yes.
Terry, this is good. This is good. This is fine. But it was better when we were together in the studio. What I really don't like, and this is a direction radio has gone in, my co-host on my morning show works remotely, and there's no cameras. I don't see him. I only hear him on my headphones. He's broadcasting from his house. And that gets clunky sometimes, and I don't like it. I don't like it. I would like him to make the drive in to the studio, but they don't force him to, so he doesn't. And I think that the quality of the show suffers as a result.
And I don't know if it's just what I hear because I've done this for a living for so long, but I've heard it on the radio here in Vancouver. There's a particular station that has the girl doing traffic for the morning show, and she's at home. And I know she's at home. And she sounds like she's at home. And I think to myself, what the fuck do you know about traffic from your upstairs bedroom while your kids are downstairs having breakfast? It's a load of bullshit. And I can hear it, and for me it's a tune out. I think, I've always thought of, morning radio should be the gang at the table. Shooting ideas around the table and yelling at each other across the table. I think it takes away. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the ingredient is, but there's something missing when you're not there.
I remember a moment, Terry, when the laughs were going and Patty was in the room with you, and I think maybe Ted, you were too, but either way, Terry cut the microphone and said, "What a bitch," and then put the microphones back up just to add a little bit to the laughter. It's one of those great technical things to just make it go a little bit longer and further.
During the pandemic, even network newscasts had people reporting from their homes or working from their homes. I remember watching CBC News Channel, and there was a story on a tsunami in the South Pacific. Let's go to Natalie Kalata to get the details, and they cut to Natalie Kalata in her living room in Don Mills. And she's talking about the tsunami in the South Pacific. And I was saying to myself, please, 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 at the end, I want her to go, Natalie Kalata, CBC News, my house. But she didn't.
Well, you know what? For years now, the Supper Hour broadcasts have been doing that. They put a reporter upstairs, and they go, and now we go live to the newsroom for the coverage of, because they've only got one reporter left. And they make it feel like there's something going on when it's really, hey, Bob, you go upstairs and we'll shoot you from up there.
Yeah, or stand outside the front door. That was another good one with one of the local stations here. Yeah.
Terry, we recorded a podcast like that, by the way.
Did we?
Yeah, the summer you were here, I put you in the dining room. And then I recorded in the basement.
That's right. Live. We go live to my dining room table. I remember now.
I want to talk about one of your sponsors that you have, and that's Sugar Sammy, who always seems to start off his world tour in Winnipeg. For whatever reason, I think he's got a connection with Winnipeg. It's sort of the crossroads of Canada. It's a good warm-up, good feel. He's got a great relationship with, I think, the people at the venue where he speaks at. So he did the bilingual show, where basically what happened is all of St. Boniface came to the show. But I loved how he was trying stuff out about, do you know this? Do you know that? What do you watch on TV? He was feeling it out and being funny. And then he mentioned Mike Ward, and it didn't land or resonate. There wasn't a lot of buzz in the room. So I thought, because you're working with him and would know, tell everybody about Mike Ward and just how big he is.
You know who I was thinking of? I was thinking of Mike this week. And this is excellent that you brought this up, Matt, because Carl Tremblay passed away at the age of 47 in Quebec and caused a national, what they call in Quebec, a national sensation, both in Quebec and across most French-speaking countries in the world. And the French press that I read this week all commented on how people literally, an hour flight from Montreal have no idea who Carl Tremblay was. and he was, by the way, he was a big pop star with a band called the Cowboy
Frigant.
Les Cowboy Frigant.
Thank you. My accent went away there. And it was a massive sensation. And I was thinking of when I was reading these French press articles about how English Canada had no idea who that was. I thought of Mike Ward. I thought Mike Ward can't walk the streets in Montreal. Well, he can walk the streets, but he gets recognized everywhere he goes, and is so widely known across the world where there are French-speaking people. You know, imagine having the most listened to podcast on the planet. You know, that's bigger than you know, some of the big English podcasts or Canadian podcasts. And yet Mike Ward, I think, in Toronto, I don't think they know who he is. And again, that's an hour flight away. Mike came to prominence nationally a little bit with the story of him taking his case of a joke, making fun. I don't want to go into the story because it's long and complicated. He made fun of a kid who was in the news in Quebec. Told the joke.
It was a kid with a disability, and Mike didn't make fun of the kid. He made fun of a circumstance that the kid was involved in, and the kid sued him and won. And Mike took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and that's where Mike won. Mike ultimately won.
Mike won.
Sorry, Terry.
Yeah.
I just thought it was important to point out, and it's an important element of that story.
You're right.
He did not make fun of the kid. He made fun of the circumstance.
Yeah, I misspoke. You're right about that, and Mike would have jumped all over me for that because that's a big part of the story, and I had it wrong. Anyway, I think people across the country may have known him as that comedian who took his case to the Supreme Court, but they don't know him like the way Quebecers know and love him. This guy is, what would you compare him to, Ted? I was going to say the George Carlin of Quebec, but that's not really fair.
Yeah, I don't know. He has his own style. He doesn't emulate anyone. He's got his own style. And the thing that's interesting to me is I think he's just as funny in English as he is in French, but for whatever reason, he hasn't caught on across the rest of the country. That might be because he hasn't really made the effort, because he can do so well here. Yeah. He makes a killing in Quebec. He doesn't need to go to English Canada to make a living. He does well enough right here, but he's as fluently bilingual as you can possibly be. If you met Mike, you wouldn't know that he is mother tongue francophone. He speaks English like the three of us speak English, possibly even better sometimes.
Yeah. You're probably right about that, Ted, because he hasn't made the he hasn't made the effort. I don't know if it's the word effort is right, but he hasn't put a plan together to conquer the country, and
he hasn't had to.
No, and as you point out, anybody who knows the Quebec star system knows you don't need to do that if you don't want to. Sugar Sammy, I think, has conquered the country because it was something that he aspired to do, and boy, has he done it and done it extremely well by making some really brave and interesting choices, including taking a bilingual show across the country to places like Winnipeg, Calgary, and Edmonton. I think that's really, really fascinating. But that might be the difference. May be right there, Matt. As Ted points out, Mike doesn't need to, and maybe hasn't wanted to.
It feels like a lot of effort for no apparent result. It's a big country, and Terry, you know this because you toured with Street Heart.
Yep.
And you'd go across the country, and the venues you'd play in front of smaller and smaller and smaller as you go. I see this with podcast numbers from really popular Toronto personalities, and even those who have some national personalities as well. If you weren't on the radio in that market, your podcast doesn't do very well.
Right.
Very simply. You look at the heat map, it is all centered around Toronto.
Right.
It doesn't transfer to Alberta. And then we had some Alberta personalities do some podcasts. I think of Carrie Dahl as being one, and it is all Alberta. Ryan Jesperson left Ched. He owns Alberta, Saskatchewan, a little bit of Manitoba, but then it gets like the street heart audiences. It gets thinner and thinner as you go.
Right.
Canada doesn't have a star system. It's large. I don't know if word doesn't travel very well or our cultures just spread too far apart. It's again, for Mike, it would be a lot of effort for no apparent result.
I think it's, it's regional, I suppose, when I think of people like Rick Mercer and some music artists, of course, can go into any part of the country and do well. But I think that it dovetails back to my, my theory about, at least with radio guys, podcasts, the numbers obviously play out. When we look at our breakdown, Matt, it's broken down for not just the province, but the numbers are broken down into, Laval, RDP, St. Leonard, just like a radio audience. We're able to look, and then there's a little tiny blip in Alberta, from maybe all the Quebecers that moved out to Alberta. We have, I don't know, a couple of, people listen in Singapore. It's obviously, as you point out, ex-Montrealers, but it's all rooted around the people that know and are familiar with those personalities. And I think that would be, obviously is true of, like Ryan, like Jerry Forbes, like Don Percy, like these are names that resonate with the people that live in those particular places, much like me and Ted.
Ted, you've got another pot. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you can speak to this. How much of it is marketing? Because I don't think Terry and I do a great job of marketing ourselves. Terry's wife does a good job of marketing us, but I don't remember the last time I put on a social media post where I posted a clip of the podcast. Please like and share. Those standard things that apparently you're supposed to do when you're trying to market your podcast. I just throw the clip up and say, here's who we had on and here's what he said this week. I wonder if that's why podcasts tend to stay local, because they're not marketed properly.
Oh, podcast marketing is it's a wild and crazy place. I mean, you have sponsors and they have the ability to reach their customers. How can you go in through your sponsors to tell them about the podcast? So I know we always go to social media, but no one's leaving a TikTok to go to your show. When they see you, you're actually just reminding them to go and listen to the show that they already love. It's a long journey for them to look at your clip and then say, "Oh, I'm going to try that out." But, listen, they do a great job. You've got TikToks and Reels that are going out with highlights. I saw one with Bruce Hills that reminded me that I need to listen to the show, and it's going to be a good combination. I haven't done it yet, but I will. So it's just different types of marketing.
Yeah. I also think that, and Ted and I talked about this last weekend when I was in Montreal, I also think we can do and should do, my wife said we should have a banner up. We should have a banner manufactured and have a banner up at Strangers in the Night, where there's a big collection of people who are our target audience, and become, sort of a co-sponsor with an event like that. And the other thing that we toyed with doing that we ended up not doing just because it was a little bit expensive at the time was we wanted to buy traffic tags on CHOM, the radio station we used to work at. Traffic brought to you by the Standing By podcast featuring Terry and Ted. And I got a kick out of the idea of that, but I wasn't sure how effective it would be. But I think if you're going to approach it like we're approaching it as a local radio show that happens to be on a podcast platform, we should think about things like supporting local events, big events, the Barbecue Fest in Pierrefonds, or the Strangers in the Night event in August, or, the different fundraisers where we could just put up a banner saying,
all those things we did in radio, going out to appearances, meeting people, works. Yeah. I've seen traffic tags work. Radio is one of the best things radio does was marketing itself.
Yeah.
Marketing shows, promotion, reminding people to listen.
Yes.
All those things. Radio does such a good job of it. They just don't have as much to market anymore. But, us all being radio people need to think back to what worked. Listen, if you can afford a bus board or a billboard, go get it. If you can, and if you can contra anything, do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And also we noticed it the other night at this event we were hosting. There were close to 600 people there, and we shook a lot of hands and spoke to a lot of people, and a lot of people had nice things to say about the podcast. And it reminded me of the early days of trying to remind people that we worked in morning radio. Hey, don't forget to listen. We'll say hi to you Monday morning. We can't do that, but if you can have an interaction with people, and get some feedback from people, there's so many similarities to the radio world. And whenever we talk about it, think about it, go through it, I look back and I think, man, radio was stupid to give up this space. They really were. They just walked away from it.
They could own both spaces if they tried.
Yes.
You know what? The saying hi to people on the radio thing still works, and I know that because I still work on the radio, and I still say hi to people, and they get the biggest kick out of it. I met a guy at the IGA one day, and he had his two 10-year-old boys with him. They might not even have been 10. They might have been 8. Twin boys. And the guy introduced himself, said he listens every morning, and these are my sons, and I don't remember the boys' names, but I said, I'm going to give you a shout-out tomorrow morning, and I did, and I mentioned the boys' names, and he sent me a note and said those boys went off to school with the biggest shit-eating grins on their face, and they spent the whole day telling everybody at school, Ted Bird talked about us on the radio this morning. That still works. People still get the biggest charge out of hearing their name on the radio.
The magic of radio. I used to, when I first got to Montreal back in 1984, I would go home at night with, the first thing I would do is before I even emptied my pockets of money, I would empty my pockets of crumpled cocktail napkins. And on all of those cocktail napkins were notes of people's names, where they worked, where they were from, what we talked about it. And I would bring a bunch of crumpled cocktail napkins into work a few hours later. And it just resonated. There's a magic about that just, as Ted says, never, ever goes away. I still meet people who say, you said hi to my mom for her 75th birthday, or I was a weather kid with you guys. And, one time I got a tour of the station with you guys. Those things, I don't know. There's just there's a magic about that medium that hasn't gone away, that the big corporations haven't figured out how to capitalize on.
One of the things that popped up on Twitter early on when you were starting, one of your listeners said, I don't understand podcasts. What's a season? And it's one of the things I do when people ask me about their shows. They say, oh, should I do seasons? And then I bust out and Terry, Ted, you'll remember the Sopranos. What's a fidget? What constitutes a fidget? I go, what constitutes a season? And so I'll ask everybody, what constitutes a season? And they sort of will say, well, I guess I'm taking a break and I might come back. But one of the things you guys have done really, really well is you have defined what seasons are to your audience. So early on, this person who tweeted at you didn't understand and was just starting. But I think everybody understands that when you have a new season, it's going to be 10 episodes. We know now that 2 of them are going to be just the 2 of you. You're going to have 8 guests. And it's whenever Terry can get himself from Vancouver to the studio, and when Ted can get himself from the West Island to the studio, out come these 10 episodes. That's a season.
Yeah, and I think what's happened, Matt, is it indicates there are new episodes coming. I think people that are familiar with podcasts know that they can go back. Our very first episode is still there. You can still listen to it. It never goes away, which is also a great attribute for sponsors. The ads we did on that episode 2 years ago, or however long it was, that episode never goes away. So if you're introducing new listeners to the new season of the podcast, hopefully that if you're listening to it for the first time because you like Mitch Garber, and you think, oh, I don't know who these guys are, but let me go Google it. Let me go to the link tree and see what other episodes are there that I could maybe. And I've seen that happen. I've seen when we release a new season, I'll go back and look at some of the numbers of, previous seasons with different guests, and they've gone up. The listens have increased. People went back to look for Pierre Hood. They went back to look for Dave Stubbs, and it's interesting to me that now, as you point out, a new season just means new episodes. That Ted and I got together for, as you point out, 10 episodes, and there will be 10 new ones there. And when there's a new season, that's 10 new episodes, but you can go back anytime. I'm still puzzled by some people that say, what time's your podcast on? We still get notes like that. And I think, oh, I don't know how to explain that, but
whatever time you want it to be.
Exactly. Yeah. The joy of podcasts. Anytime you like.
Do you record 5 episodes over 2 days?
We try not to. We did this past season. We did the last 3 in one day, and by the end of it, both my eyeballs were in the same socket. And Terry was sitting across the table laughing out loud at me because I was so shot.
Because I've known Ted so long, and I sat across him for so many years, or across from him for so many years. There's just kind of a look, and the lids get really sort of metal garage doors. And they just and he's not sleeping, but he's not there.
Tell him the story about the comedy show the other night.
Yeah.
Right at the end of the comedy.
Ted, we were so tired. Well, both of us,
the show was too long. It was a 3-hour show. That's too long for a comedy show.
Yeah, it's literally people were running for the exits.
Yeah.
When I was reading the raffle numbers at the end of the night, people were like, bye, and running for the exits. And just before the headliner was coming to an end, before he was wrapping up his set, he said, Ted and I were right backstage, right behind the curtain, and Ted couldn't hear the headliners say, just to wrap it up tonight, I'm going to do another song. And Ted looked at me with horror in his eyes and went, did he say he was going to do another song? And fell backwards like, Jesus Christ, don't sing a song. I got to go home. And the look of horror in your eyes.
I was kind of leaning against the wall.
Yeah.
Is he going to do a song?
Did he say he's going to do a song? And maybe it was a had to be there moment, but it was reminiscent of, for years and years and years, and Ted's still doing it. I don't know how he does. I think it's because he keeps himself in such great physical shape. Every morning at 3:30, it catches up with you eventually. You get that sort of look in your eye like, oh my God, I have to lie down like right now.
Yeah. I've asked Terry this question before, Matt. How many long-term radio morning men can you name who live to a ripe old age? Not too many.
Or how many long-term radio morning guys who have not had any medical issues? My wife talks about this all the time. Talks about, I think mine was, it obviously had something to do with genetics, heart valves. That was my issue. But also the lack of, what science is telling you about how important sleep is to the health of your heart. When you look back on it, there's a lot of guys who were big, famous morning men who some of them dropped dead, didn't make it into their 70s, or who were stricken with all kinds of different things. Again, it's not, you don't work in a coal mine, but sleeping 3 hours a night for 35 years is not a good prescription for good health.
Sleep deprivation is a real health factor that you probably don't hear enough about.
And you don't give a shit about when you're 35. You go, yeah,
Well, yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And then kicks you in the heart.
Well, I think it is a disproportionate number of on-air people. And Terry, you're one. Bob Steele's another. Drex in Vancouver.
This is what Jess was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just in the last year that I can.
Scruff Connors.
Yep.
Just tons and tons of them.
Well,
Ted,
that's depressing. I'm sorry I brought it up.
Ted, how's Sam doing? What's he doing? Podcasting?
Sam has a podcast or two that he does out of the studio. Well, one of them he does out of the studio at what used to be Ryerson University, but is now Toronto Metropolitan University because Ryerson owned slaves and was a horrible, horrible man, apparently. He does one called Bird Core. That's his own podcast. I don't think he does that from Ryerson. I think he does that from his own studio. And he works at Elevation Pictures in their promotions department. That's his foot in the door to what he wants to do. He wants to be involved in television and filmmaking. I think ultimately he wants to be what's called a showrunner, which is what it sounds like. I think it's someone he wants to create and write and oversee television series and or movies. And I think he's got the ability to do it.
And the talent.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the charm. And he's a very, very bright, very, very talented young man. And Ted and I both have reservations on his private jet because that's coming.
Yep. He's
So
very emotionally mature as well. That's what I think is going to serve him well in a business that's full of emotionally immature people, and I'm one of them. He's very emotionally mature. He's really emotionally and psychologically solid. Like, I aspire to be more like him. I really, really do. Yeah. And I think that also is going to serve him very well.
He doesn't flip out when he breaks a shoelace.
No, sir. He doesn't flip out ever.
No.
I mean, so often I'll ask people who come on this show, what was it like growing up in a broadcasting household? Now I get to ask the reverse. What's it like having a kid, a son, who is starting down a path of broadcasting or media, as it were? I'm glad you see that.
Sam is also in the new Drake video. Did I tell you that, Ter?
I've seen it. You did. You did tell me, and I follow him on social media, so it was pretty cool.
Yeah, he's the guy wearing the dog mask and marching down the long dark corridor. He's the bulldog. Yeah. He knows the producer. That's how he got that little gig. And Drake was not on the set the day that Sam shot, but I just thought it was the coolest thing. You don't know it's him because he's wearing a mask, but I just thought it was the coolest thing that he was on a Drake video.
And that's how you get going. That's exactly how you get going, is exactly what he's doing. Sam's not at home complaining about the rent and how expensive things are and blah, 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 and you can't find and nobody helped me and blah, blah, blah. He's out there and he's digging in and getting it done. And that's, Bruce Hills talked about this on our podcast, which is up now. He said, when opportunity knocks, jump on it. Well, it doesn't matter if you're working for free, and I think Sam did work for free for a little while. And you meet people.
Bruce said, all you need is momentum.
Yes, yeah, and I think Sam's already building that because that's what happens. A producer says, "Hey, you want to be the bulldog in the Drake video? You're fucking right, I do. I'll be right there." That's as you said, Ted. He's on his way already. I think. We love him.
Yeah, I sure hope so. He's light years ahead of where I was at his age.
Yeah.
How old is he?
24.
We are at season 6, episode 5.
My boy.
We're at season 6, episode 5. Season 7, sometime 2024, we'll say, who do you want to have as a guest? Wish list. And we're going to mention this because people who are listening to this podcast, we're going to will them on. We're going to make it happen.
Okay.
All right. We're going
All
to put it out to the universe, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you want as
Ted?
a guest?
I haven't even thought of it yet. I haven't even thought of it.
Ted and I usually have a sort of, I can't call it a meeting. We have a conversation. And we begin writing down ideas. I would, you know who I would love to have on the podcast? I would like to talk to Guy Alapage of Tout le monde en parle. I'd love to have him on the podcast to talk about his pathway to, for people who don't know, it's one of the most watched television shows, live television shows in Quebec every Sunday night. And I find him fascinating, and I find that whole story of that Tout le monde en parle, I find that very, very interesting.
Sugar Sammy would be a natural, obviously, since he's one of our sponsors. But it's trying to schedule the podcast around Sammy being in Montreal because he's literally all over the world.
Yeah, and we wanted to have him on this season 6, and the dates just wouldn't line up. We'd like to have Mike Ward back on. We've already had Mike on the podcast, but we'd love to have him back. And I'd be interested to talk to the guy with the thing. He's a good guy.
He's fascinating.
His name is it'll come to me probably tomorrow.
You're doing your imitation of me there.
But
we're over an hour now.
This is
Hey, would you take Valerie Plante?
I'd love to talk to Valerie Plante. I got I don't agree with her on so many levels, but we had a really nice conversation with the guy Sterling Downey.
Yep.
Who serves with Valerie Plante. He's the counselor for Verdun.
And was deputy mayor for a while.
We had a conversation with him about, I've got a different idea of what cities should be. I guess because of the era I grew up in, I don't agree with a lot of what goes on, and I don't agree with the direction that they've taken Montreal in. And it's too late. Montreal has completely changed. They've changed it. And I would love to sit down and talk to her about, what it is she's doing and why she thinks it's the best way for Montreal to go, the direction that Montreal should go in. And listen, what do I know? People keep voting her in, so I guess that's what Montrealers want. But it's a new, I don't know, it's just a new way of looking at cities that I don't like. I like cities that are big and electric and fast and, and they want, they want cities that are scooter driven and full of unicorns. That's not my thing. I would love to have, I'd love to have a chat with her. And also, this is the other thing. I got to get. I've got this off my chest before. This is what burns my ass about municipal politics. No one elected you to save the planet. Does the planet need saving? I'm not denying that for 1 second. But you're the mayor. You're the mayor of the city. Make sure that the roads are open, the garbage is picked up, that the pipes work, that there's water coming into the sink. Make sure the city runs for its citizens. Your projects about straws and bags and scooters and unicorns and apple picking and ponds in the middle of the city and, trees and everything that you're going to do to save the planet. I don't think that that's the mayor's purview. That's just my personal opinion. Somebody else should be looking after that. The mayor should be running the city. But
take care of your own backyard first.
Thank you. I'd love to have her on to talk about it. And I got a little bit of a chance to have that discussion with Sterling when he was on too.
I spoke to Sugar Sammy, who said August 2024 would be the time that would be the window I would be allowed to interview him on the podcast.
Excellent.
He gave me a window, and he said
Excellent.
this would be in advance of his 2025 tour. And I said, who plans that far ahead?
Oh boy, he does.
Apparently he does.
Yeah, he does. He's. It's really fascinating talking to him because we've become good friends and have been friends for a while. Sammy was remarkable with regards to my wife when I was in the hospital and flirting with death. Sammy was he was amazing. He checked in with her morning and at night. And when I got out of the hospital, Sammy happened to be coming through on tour, and he said, "Listen, I'd like you to come to the show, only if you're up to it." Blah blah blah. And it was about a month or 5 weeks after I was out of the hospital, and he gave me 2 seats on the aisle. So he said, if you want to leave, if you get too tired, just go. Like, he's such good people. He's such a good, decent human being. And so whenever he comes to town, he was just in town in Vancouver about a month or two, maybe 5 weeks ago, doesn't matter. And we wanted to have dinner, but that was a dinner that we planned like 3-4 months ago. He said, I'm free on this Sunday or that Monday at this time. It's all so, like, he knows where he's going to be, and he has to be, because not only is he, a touring comedian, he's also a very big TV star in France. So he's got to be, you got to plan that shit way in advance, I guess.
Thank you, by the way, for getting diverticulitis back in 2004.
No problem.
And because what happened was he came in to co-host the show morning show with me.
Did he
And
really?
yeah, and from
I was
there,
in the hospital. Yeah.
you were in the hospital,
Yes.
and I thought, what are we going to do? I said, well, I better call for backup. And he had some shows, and he just came in and he'd do, 20 minutes, a half hour for about, for 3 days. For the 3 days we were in the hospital. And then from there, I went to Winnipeg, and then he had 10 days in the middle of January. And it was, as advertised, it was like minus 40.
Yeah.
But he came down to Power 97, did, half hour every day, an hour every day. And, I think from there developed a little bit of a relationship with Winnipeg, whereby he does start off the tour here quite often. But, since then, I'll send him a text, and I'm waiting for him to say, "Who's this?" He doesn't. I'm coming to Winnipeg.
Yeah. He did what we did in radio. He shook a million hands and starts at the small clubs and builds up an audience. That's what he did. When he went to France, nobody knew who he was in France. And breaking through in France is trying to break through in New York City. I think one of the first stand-up gigs he did in France was for 30 people. And now he's on television every week in France in front of an audience of 4.5 million people. And he went from, 30 people to 100 people to 200 to 2,000. And, he gets down and in there and does the work. And he's never forgotten where he came from. And if you're a Sugar Sammy fan, there's a terrific W5 piece up on YouTube where you can learn all about his past. And Ted and I have been the beneficiaries of his kindness. We had him on the radio, Ted, when he was just starting. He was still taking the bus to his gigs, eh?
Yeah, we saw him, pardon me, at the, I don't remember where we saw him, but we said to each other, we got to get him on the show, and we brought him in, and he has never forgotten that.
Yeah, brings it up all the time. Yeah.
Guys, thanks so much for doing this and taking time, and especially Ted. I hope you got your nap in earlier.
I did, as a matter of fact. I got an hour.
Okay. And Terry, is it time for your nap?
No, just before we go, I'd like to sing a song.
Did he say a song?
I got one more number, Ted.
Oh, God, he's going to sing a song.